Thank you. The final item of business is a members' business debate on motion 20295 in the name of John Finney on celebrating Scotland's wetlands on World Wetlands Day 2020. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on John Finney to open the debate. Mr Finney, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. And also like to thank members from across the Chamber for their support, and indeed the many organisations for providing briefings for this debate. Now, the Scottish Government, like many others, has declared a climate emergency, so we know that the status quo is not an option. We must review everything we do. Most importantly, we must change our outlook and our actions. And people have graphically seen the disastrous consequences of climate breakdown with regard to Australia and Indonesia, and it's prompted a lot of discussion that might not otherwise have taken place, these horrendous pictures on our television screens. So I think we need to focus our attention on the need to protect Scotland's precious environment. World Wetlands Day is actually on the 2nd of February, and our debate this evening is part of it, and can I commend the Scottish Government for their active promotion of the Year for Coasts and Waters. Now, I don't think too many people set out to destroy our environment. However, there are some selfish individuals, organisations, corporations and governments whose flawed priorities remain unchanged, whose unwillingness to take any responsibility for addressing this global emergency must be condemned and taken to task. Now, Ramsar sites are classed under the Convention on Wetlands of international importance, and the mission in that says, and I quote here, the conservation and wise use of all wetlands through local and national actions and international cooperation as a contribution towards achieving sustainable development throughout the world. Now, the UK signed that convention in 1976, and globally there are 2,200 sites across 169 countries included in a list of wetlands of international importance. That's the Ramsar list. In Scotland, we are honoured. We've got 51 Ramsar sites designated as internationally important wetlands, covering a total of about 313,000 hectares. Now, in Scotland, most Ramsar sites are linked to the Natura 2000 network, either as a special protection area or a special area of conservation, and all are underpinned by sites, the designation sites of special scientific interest. And their importance for many reasons, not least the wide variety of water birds, bogs, lochs, coastal wetlands and other water-dependent habitats and species. A habitat that's a unique home for a wide array birds, fish, excuse me, mammals and invertebrates, and provide hunting grounds for many other predator species. And Scotland's wetlands produce significant benefits to the overall environment, providing flood control and water filtration. Now, the climate emergency and continued development of these sites pose an existential threat to the future of Scotland's wetlands and species. And the motion calls on, welcomes calls on the Scottish Government, encouraging the Scottish Government to support continued and greater protection for Scotland's wetlands. And Scotland is globally important for peatlands as well, the world's largest expanse of blanket bog being at Forsonard in the Flow Country in the north of my region there. In 2020, Scotland's important wetlands will be celebrated with a year of coasts and waters. And wetlands can provide nature-based solutions to climate change and storing carbon and helping mitigate against more frequent storms and droughts. And globally, peatland stores nearly 30% of all carbon stored on land. So whilst the Scottish Government's Peatland Action Fund, the Biodiversity Challenge Fund and the Agri-Environment Climate Scheme have helped improve wetlands, they're still threatened by climate change and change in land use. And these are both two key drivers of biodiversity loss identified in the State of Nature report. Our wetlands are also under threat from the spread of invasive non-native species. Excuse me. Sorry. Excuse me. Scotland hosts most of the water catchments in the UK yet to be affected by the spread of invasive species. However, effective biosecurity measures are needed now to avoid damage from that intensifying threat. And nature is sadly in decline, with 11% of species at risk of extinction. A step change in narrative, policy and practice is necessary to reverse this and address the climate emergency. Climate change and changes in land use, two of the key drivers of biodiversity loss, identified, as I said earlier, in the State of Nature report. Now, if, for instance, you had a 14+ hectares of internationally important, unique and irreplaceable dune habitats, and if there were a proposal which could cause significant disruption to the natural dune processes and ecosystem, and if that proposal would bring about the spread of fertilisers and pesticides across the site and prompted widespread risk of disturbance to many of the sensitive species and habitats from increased human use of the site, I hope all members in here would have grave concerns. We know hydrological change and pollution are two key drivers in decline in natural diversity, again identified in the State of Nature report. And the Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services identifies that changes in land and sea use as most important drivers of the loss of nature. So if such a site and destructive proposal existed, you would hope that the Scottish Government would recognise the national importance in relation to natural heritage, and I'm gratified to say they have. You would hope the Scottish Government would call in any planning application with the disastrous consequences I outlined, and they have. The site is Cool Links in East Sutherland in my region, and the proposal is to build a golf course on this site of world significance. It's been considered by a public inquiry, and reporters have submitted their recommendations, and the Planning Minister, Kevin Stewart, is deliberating. Now, I accept that ministers cannot comment on any live planning matter. However, ministers can discuss the generality in terms of this motion. And why would the planning decision be so significant? Well, if this damaging proposal were given the go-ahead, it would send a very clear signal to those around the world watching this case. It could have implications for the future of all protected sites in Scotland. Now, I readily accept that each individual planning case is considered on its merits. However, if consent were given to such a proposal, it would be more difficult to refuse future applications for development sites with similar levels of protections and conservation designation. It would also cast doubt on Scottish Government's commitment to address the climate and nature emergency. It could affect Scotland's performance against global nature targets, the HA targets, particularly Target 11, regarding conserving protected wildlife sites, but also targets 5, 12 and 14. And it would suggest the Scottish Government do not have regard to the views of Scottish Natural Heritage, their own organisation, who take an evidence-based approach to all matters and have proposed this proposal. Now, Scotland's declared a climate emergency. The Scottish Wildlife Trust, one of the many organisations that provided information for this debate, tell us that Sustainable Development Goal progress has stalled. A joined-up approach is needed to achieve any of the goals. They're designed to be interconnected, but current approach is fractured. Natural climate solutions can help achieve goals and reflect the interconnectedness of climate change and biodiversity in both rural and urban areas. The Minister should show decisive action in protecting our wetlands and coasts. Ministers should reject the Cool Links application so it does not set a precedent for unsustainable development. Now, I would like to draw the Chamber's attention to this report here.
Briefly, because you're at 8 minutes. I'll give you another minute, but we're
Thank you very much indeed, President Officer. I will be brief. This is the reasons for the proposed partial denotification of Foravan sites links SSSI. This had a dune habitat and intertidal sand, and if I quote from paragraph 2, the construction of many links golf course within the SSI has adversely affected the coastal geomorphology of Scotland and sand dune habitat notified natural features, as well as interrupting natural dune processes. There's been a loss of habitat. There's potential indirect impacts for the use of irrigation, fertilisers and herbicides, excuse me, which in time may affect plant communities. Now, I accept no two sites are the same, and in conclusion, can I say there are stark similarities between these two. Scottish Government's actively promoting the Year of Coasts and Waters. We must learn from past mistakes. Ministers must reject the damaging application for a golf course at Cool Links. What better way for Scotland to celebrate the start of the Year of Coasts and Waters in the run-up to World Wetlands Day?
Thank you very much. I'm quite tight for time, so I'm going to ask members. Understand, I gave you a little longer because you're the member giving the debate, but I have to ask other members to keep to 4 minutes, please. Stuart Stevenson, followed by Finlay Carson, followed by Claudia Beamish, followed by Ross Greer. Stuart Stevenson.
Presiding Officer, let me start by congratulating John Finney on bringing this subject to the Chamber tonight. In my constituency, we have a wetland that's part of the Ramsar Convention on wetlands of international importance. So I'm proud to represent the Loch of Strathbeg. That's a shallow, nutrient-rich loch and the largest dune slack pool in Britain. It's a rich habitat for flora and fauna with reed beds, freshwater marshes and much more beside. But most importantly, it's a wintering habitat for many wetland bird species, geese, whooper swan and many other varieties of waterfowl. Wetlands are, of course, some of the most biodiverse ecosystems in the planet and our most productive ecosystems. 3% of our land cover, 10% of our total biodiversity, and they create resilience in a changing environment, and that's why they're critical. But the benefits are also that they act as nature's shock absorbers in the face of extreme weather. They store rain during storms, reduce flooding, and delay the onset of droughts. Now, it may be obvious, but I'll talk about that a little bit further. We've already heard a little bit about Australia. We should think about California, both of whom have faced years of droughts over the last decade, punctuated, particularly at the moment, by tragic wildfires, even as we speak. What is telling is that California is estimated to have lost 90% of its wetlands over the last century, and in Australia, it's a figure that's very similar. It raises the question, what role would the presence of these lost wetlands play in the tragic situation we're seeing playing out? Better storage of rain during storms, rather than losing water to evaporation, perhaps, and perhaps delay the onset of drought. Now, except the destruction of wetlands is far from being the sole contributor to these tragedies, but it is one of a range of factors. Destroying wetlands has consequences. We must accept that these consequences are not yet fully realised. And critically, we must ensure that we reverse what destruction we can. I certainly have visited peatland that has been re-wetted and been astonished to see how quickly some parts of its diversity come back. Not necessarily all, but certainly a great deal of it. So on the global issue of destruction of wetlands, we've got to think big. We think that as much as 64% of the world's wetlands have been degraded since 1900. And significantly, as John Finney referred to, these are immense carbon sinks. So it's an issue that's highly relevant to the climate emergency. And of course, creating the circumstances where dry land promotes and allows fires to continue. We cannot continue with that approach. So therefore, tonight's debate makes its small contribution to our all recognising the importance of restoring wetlands, and I hope leads the way for others to challenge themselves with wetlands in other countries. Crucially, humanity's collective ignorance of wetlands is the greater challenge. I think we're engaged in the subject, but most of our population are not. We must therefore overcome that ignorance, persuade our friends, our colleagues, and people across Scotland and across the world that it is now time to act on the subject of wetlands.
Thank you very much. Finlay Carson, followed by Claudia Beamish. Mr Carson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm pleased to have the opportunity to speak in tonight's debate, and I thank John Finney for bringing it to the Chamber. As my party's spokesman on natural environment, I'm naturally taking interest in safeguarding our wetlands, recognising the role they play in providing a habitat for a huge range of species and the role they play in protecting our wider environment. In my own constituency, we have a wealth of wetlands to rival anywhere else in Scotland or indeed the world. And we have a number of Ramsar sites, which are internationally important wetlands and places of interest for a wide variety of water birds, bogs, lochs, coastal wetlands and other water-dependent habitats and species. Loch Ken River Dee Marshes is a site containing an area of swamp, ferns, grassland and carr woodland, and it's one of the best examples of semi-natural freshwater systems in North West Europe.
The site supports internationally important roosting numbers of Greenland white-fronted geese and Icelandic grey-lag geese, and there are 4 internationally important aquatic plants and 3 nationally important aquatic invertebrates found within the wetland complex. Silverflow is a broad glacial valley in the Galloway Hills. It's a nature reserve in SSSI, and it contains a series of patterned blanket mires, which constitutes the least disturbed and most varied extent of acid peatland in southern Scotland, and is one of the most important systems of blanket mire in the whole of Great Britain. And close to my home in Newton Stewart, we have Wigton Bay Local Nature Reserve, the largest nature reserve in Britain. And the estuary, with a large area of salt, marsh and mudflats, is vitally important for many of the species that live there, especially for the salt-intolerant plants and winter wildfowl. The reserve is popular as a venue for a range of recreational activities, including angling, wildfowling and bird watching. And Kirkconnell Flow is an area of blanket bog considered to be one of the best in the United Kingdom. But the disappointing fact is that these are internationally and nationally important sites, but they're not well known even to locals. And more generally, people don't even appreciate the importance of wetlands. But I would like to highlight a wetland garden which does do its bit to raise awareness. It's an accessible wetland which a vast majority of people can visit, located in Liswalt near Stranraer, and it's the wonderful Ardurin Wetland Gardens. The name incidentally means Glen of the Otter, and it's become a real tourist attraction for the village. The community maintains this wonderful site, all doing it voluntarily, having initially created the facility themselves. There is much to do and see, but most importantly, it has a wonderful wetland featuring a wide range of plants and animal life. Amongst those making it their home are mallards, moorhens, with geese regularly nesting in the wetland, along with frogs, newts, butterflies, dragonflies, damselflies and numerous other pond dwellers. The wetland has a bird hide where other wildlife species are frequent visitors, including red squirrels, deer, woodpecker, birds of prey, and you never know, you might be lucky enough to spot the main attraction, which the facility is named after, the otter. And I must give special praise to the Wetland Watchers Group, who are a group of young people who eagerly volunteer to help after initial appeal from the Community Association. Made up of youngsters between 7 and 17, they're involved in many aspects of running the garden and developing ideas as how they would like the garden to operate in the future. Since 2013, the Alderan Wetland Watchers have been registered in the World Wildlife Volunteering Scheme, which rewards youngsters depending on the amount of volunteering work they carry out. The mixture of community engagement, enhancing and protecting the natural environment, and hugely important awareness raising all result in a host of great positive work going on. We've recently focused on climate change, but we must ensure that areas like wetlands are not forgotten about. They play a huge role in addressing both climate and biodiversity emergencies we face. We must reverse that decline, and one action we can take is to raise awareness and support the community's efforts like Alderan and Wigton Local Nature Reserve, which are so vital to their own communities and showcase a whole host of wildlife and wetlands to locals and visitors alike.
Thank you very much. Call Claudia Beamish, followed by Ross Green.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. My thanks go to John Finney for bringing this debate to the Chamber so we can all celebrate World Wetlands Day together. These watery habitats deserve tribute for the invaluable service they provide for carbon sequestration, to flood prevention, to water filtration and supply, to our biodiversity, and much more, and indeed for the solace that we find through them by visiting them. For thousands of years, humans have managed and manipulated the watercourses and subsurface and surface hydrology of our lands to enable development and infrastructure. The State of Nature 2019 report explains that poor legacy that this has left for wetlands. Today, we have far less wetland cover than we did in the early 20th century. And today also, we sadly find 30% of the remaining designated wetland features classed as unfavourable or unfavourable and recovering due to management. They are yet another signifier of the ecological crisis which Scotland faces, along with the rest of the world. Many of our habitats and their flora and fauna are under pressure from climate change, extraction, burning, pollution and invasive species, to name but some. Protections and enhancements for biodiversity need investment and policy certainty from government. The obvious live example, which John Finney has highlighted, is Cool Links, a place of fantastic wildlife protected under 3 designations, which he's highlighted, and also he has highlighted the commitments which are made because of it being a Ramsar wetland site. Many people across Scotland await the Minister's decision on the proposed development, and I have written to the Minister, having heard from people across Scotland who have concerns about this, and urged him, along with many others, to give due consideration to biodiversity. We face climate and environment emergencies, as we keep saying, and this decision is all the more significant given that 2020 is the Scottish Government's year of coasts and of waters. I do not underestimate the importance of bringing new jobs to a rural area, and this development could boost the economy to some degree, but it's important to strike a fair balance with environmental protections, and the ecological significance of Cool Links must be taken very, very seriously. There are, of course, let's remember, opportunities for benefits of ecotourism to be developed if the application fails as well. As John Finney says, this decision will be carefully watched in Scotland and indeed globally. Wetlands in all their forms are places of great natural beauty, and my thanks go to Rambler Scotland for their briefing, for highlighting the public health outcomes of outdoor recreation in these wonderful landscapes. Wetlands including peat bogs, swamps and peatlands, and these terms can sound a bit soggy, but the fantastic and rare wildlife that live there are often worth the risk of some wet socks. My region of South Scotland has exactly this, as Finn Carson has highlighted. And in the climate emergency, the sequestration capabilities are hugely important, particularly of peatlands, which globally store nearly 30% of all carbon lands. Members may recall I attempted to modernise the system of permission and extraction rights for peatlands in the Planning Act. And in this climate emergency, this system is no longer fit for purpose. The Planning Minister is pursuing this through the Chief Planner to seek clarification with planning authorities, and I await the results of this. We as a Parliament are committed to reaching net zero emissions by 2045, the net part being important here. Let us not neglect the natural allies in doing this, and let us protect our wetlands for so many reasons. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Ross Greer to be followed by Gillian Martin. Mr Greer, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to my Green colleague John Finney for bringing a debate on Scotland's wetlands to Parliament. We've already heard about the importance of wetlands to our biodiversity and the wealth of fantastic and rare species that they support. That's why last February I raised concerns about the Scottish Government's new guidance on the protection of our 51 Ramsar sites. The response from the Government was to insist that the fact they're designated as sites of special scientific interest gives adequate protection. But the evidence suggests otherwise, as the impact of Donald Trump's golf course at Many has shown. And in my own region, there's still a question over whether it will protect South Annan Sands. That's a fantastic marine environment at Hunterston, which is threatened by dredging proposals. The South Annan situation should illustrate starkly the inadequacy of relying on SSSI designation for protection. If 500,000 tonnes of dredging to decommission oil rigs in the same location doesn't automatically trigger the need for an environmental impact assessment, it's clear that these regulations need strengthened. Looking at our 51 Ramsar sites around Scotland, we get great insights into why wetlands are such a vital part of our environment. The 2 designated wetlands in my region are really strong examples of that. First, there's a string of wetland sites along the Clyde, from Clydebank and Erskine to Helensburgh and Greenock. These are mainly tidal mudflats with an internationally important population of redshanks. And last month, this part of the Clyde featured quite heavily in reports of a new map that was produced as part of some peer-reviewed research by Climate Central, which showed a number of sites threatened by flooding before 2050 due to the unfolding climate crisis. Most reports focused on the human impact, understandable given that everywhere from most of Clydebank and Dumbarton to Partick and Govan, as well as a large part of Glasgow Airport, could be underwater. But the rising tide isn't good news for existing wetlands either. Changes in tide levels can make fantastic mudflat habitats like those along the Clyde uninhabitable. The climate emergency threatens biodiversity here in Scotland, and it is doing so now. We need to take urgent action to stop climate chaos, and in Scotland that means a Scottish Green New Deal. And the other site in my region, the other Ramsar site, the other wetland site, is at the mouth of the Endrick on the edge of Loch Lomond, in the southeast of the loch. Most of this site is part of the RSPB's Loch Lomond Reserve. The winter population here includes 2% of the world's Greenland white-fronted geese, and a beaver has recently been spotted in the area. The RSPB organised brilliant events here, guided walks and school visits to let families and local communities know and learn much more about this amazing habitat. I've spoken in this chamber a few times now about the Save Loch Lomond campaign, who fought successfully so far to save a site in Balloch from an inappropriate and environmentally destructive flamingo land tourist development. The campaign and I have often talked about the need for a plan to showcase the natural beauty of Loch Lomond, to help visitors and tourists enjoy the nature and the landscape without destroying it. Just 5 miles up the road from Balloch, there's an example of exactly that at the mouth of the River Endrick. But at other sites across the loch, we are increasingly seeing aggressive and destructive resort and other development proposals coming into play. The climate emergency and pressure from commercial developers are major live threats to our wetlands here in Scotland. World Wetlands Day is a time to reconsider the importance of our wetlands and to recommit ourselves to tackle these global and local threats to their future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr Greer. And I call Gillian Martin to follow by Rachel Hamilton. Ms Martin, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First of all, I want to thank John Finney for bringing this debate to the Chamber and congratulate him on his excellent speech, which powerfully illustrates the importance of wetlands. We, as others have said, have faced two significant crises. The planet is heating up and our wildlife is decreasing in numbers, and the twin climate change and biodiversity crisis go hand in hand. We've rightly seen the focus of our politics in the last couple of years placed on the action needed to halt climate change, and the IPCC report at the end of 2018 was the precursor of some real soul-searching amongst every Scottish political party, as our citizens rightly demanded we prioritise tackling climate change in our work. Of course, around the same time as the IPCC report came out, there was another hugely significant, perhaps less headline-grabbing report on the global biodiversity crisis by the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, or IPBES for short. The 2019 State of Nature report made for upsetting reading, with 11% of species threatened with extinction and decreasing populations across 49% of species. Now, our wetlands hold a pretty big key in tackling both climate change and species loss. They are rich habitats, the soil and vegetation lock in carbon, particularly those in peatland areas, and are hugely significant habitats for the aquatic bird, plant and insect species. And they're often at risk from development, agriculture, and in our case in Scotland, badly managed sporting estates, particularly those with driven grouse moors. Their protection and restoration, and therefore the potential for providing a large part of the solution to sequestering carbon, has to be a priority, and their existence is the reason that we can get to net zero faster than anywhere else. I want to single out and celebrate a coastal wetland area and Ramsar site, one in the Chamber that will have heard me mention many times. Very close to my heart, it's the Ithen Estuary, which I can confidently say is my favourite place on this earth. I grew up in a house whose front windows looked across onto the dunes, and even though I don't live in that house anymore, I'm a frequent visitor to the estuary, both in my capacity as an MSP visiting my Scottish Natural Heritage colleagues, involving myself in the odd beach clean and meeting with constituents concerned about the estuary, or wanting me to go along and talk about seals in my capacity as the grey seal champion. But more often I'm just there enjoying the estuary with my family and my new wildlife watching scope that I got for my birthday last week. Over the last couple of years, the estuary and the dune ecosystems around it have been under threat, though. Some of those threats have been corporate, like the Trump golf course, which has been mentioned already, which irretrievably ruined once protected dune ecosystems along the coast in Many, or the net salmon fishing companies who massacred grey seals on site, which meant that when I was growing up there, you would never see a seal, and littered the waters with fixed fishing gear that would endanger marine life and seabirds. Now, the salmon nets have gone, and our protected seal haul-out zone regularly hosts over 1,000 basking, gloriously noisy grey seals, which have become quite the tourist attraction. But the biggest threats to the estuary have been global in origin. There's no doubt that seabird numbers have declined due to climate change, and the once record-breaking eider duck population of the estuary is a tiny fraction of what it was when I was growing up there. And I don't need to see any graphs or charts to know that. You can see it with your eyes. Wetlands are the first place we see evidence of climate change and biodiversity loss, but they're a big part of the solution to both. Protect a wetland, restore a wetland, not only does the lost line come back, but they feed life beyond the wetlands, and that includes us human beings, because if we don't have the carbon sinks and rich habitats that are wetlands, we don't have a planet that can support our lives, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Rachel Hamilton, followed by Emma Harper. Ms Harper is the last speaker in the open debate. Ms Hamilton.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to participate in John Finney's debate today and want to thank him for bringing this very important topic about wetlands to the Chamber, given their immense potential to improve biodiversity and tackle climate change. They're vitally important to our ecosystems, carbon sequestration, flood management and water purification. From the peat bogs of Greenlaw Moor to the swamps of Coldingham Common in my constituency of Ettrick, Roxburgh and Berwickshire, we have some fine examples of wetland environments. And I want to commend the Scottish Borders Council and Tweed Forum for their work, as they have both recognised the important role that wetlands play and the need for all stakeholders to be around the table in order for them to be protected. The Tweed catchment in my constituency enjoys a long history of partnership working, and this should be harnessed to tackle the crisis of declining salmon stocks. I want to take the opportunity today to talk about something a little bit different but relevant to wetlands. It is highly important because wetlands, wild salmon stocks rely on wetlands. And I held a members' debate several months ago to highlight the decline of salmon stocks and the serious impact this is having on our biodiversity and rural economy. When we look for possible solutions to reverse the decline in stocks, wetlands should rightly form part of an effective catchment management plan to help boost stocks. If we look at the life cycle of a salmon, wetlands play an important part in almost every stage of a salmon's life. Let me take you through the life cycle of a salmon very quickly, but by no means am I David Attenborough, so please bear with me. Salmonids lay their eggs in gravel beds called redds. This gravel must be small enough to be moved by the female in creating her nest, but large enough to provide sediment-free openings for the eggs and fry. That's the small salmon to develop. Silts and sediments can unfortunately coat the eggs, depriving them of oxygen, and this is where the wetlands come in. As wetlands slow the speed of the water before it enters the main river channel, sediments then settle in the wetland, not the redds, and so it reduces the chances of eggs being deprived of the vital oxygen that they do need. The inclement weather we have been having, wetlands also help to reduce peak flows in rivers after heavy rainfall, which slows the speed of the river and in turn reduces the impact of redds being washed away. A fine example is at the Philip Hock Estate, again in my constituency, where they've been preserving peat bogs in order to slow the flow of water from the Kirkstead burn into the Tweed catchment. So back to the salmon. Wetlands continue to play a role once the eggs have hatched into fry. Fry feed on the insects, and these insects may drop into the river from overhanging trees or may live in the wetlands themselves. The trees on the stream banks also shade the river and keep the stream cool enough for the fry. Wetlands help keep the water cool by releasing the cool groundwater into the stream flow. Downstream, nearer the mouth of the river, the smolts, that's the young salmon, stay for a while in the estuaries to acclimatise to the salt water and use the estuary wetlands for food and shelter. The time spent in the estuary varies with species, but some smolts rear extensively in wetlands near the sea before entering the saline water of the open sea. Once back in the streams, those adult salmon move quickly upstream to spawn as their bodies begin to deteriorate. And blockages such as dams, culverts and low water levels slow their movement upstream. Wetlands help maintain that in-stream flow by holding water from wetter seasons and releasing it during drier summers. So there you have it. It's a quick explanation, but shows how important wetlands have and are involved in every stage of a salmon's life. And that is why we must do our utmost to protect these environments in order to protect those stocks. On World Wetlands Day, and with a climate emergency, it is right that we do acknowledge that without our precious environment, our landscape, our ecosystems, the survival of many great species would be greatly lacking. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call Emma Harper. Last speaker in the opening.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Thanks also must go to John Finney for bringing this important motion to Chamber to allow us to discuss World Wetlands Day taking place on February the 2nd this year. The theme this year is wetlands and biodiversity, and it is important to note that globally 40% of all species live or breed in wetlands. And as Mr Finney has stated, this year marks nearly 50 years of the Ramsar Convention, established in 1971 in Ramsar in Iran. This is an international treaty protecting wetlands and conservation importance. This evening, I'd like to focus my remarks on noting the environmental, social and ecological importance of wetlands and to highlight some of the examples in Galloway. Presiding Officer, our wetlands in Scotland and across the UK and Europe serve many purposes. Wetlands are home to thousands of species of birds, fish, mammals and invertebrates. Wetlands are responsible for the employment of around 1 billion people worldwide, and they clean our water and act as natural flood defences, as members have discussed. Wetlands play a crucial role in our actions to tackle the climate emergency. While Dumfries and Galloway doesn't have areas of wetlands protected essentially by the Ramsar Convention, we do have special protected areas and special areas of conservation which are protected under EU law, including parts of the UNESCO Galloway and Southern Ayrshire biosphere. Presiding Officer, our biosphere, which is supported by D&G and South Ayrshire councils, is coordinated by Ed Forrest, who keeps me in the loop with biosphere activity. It is home to peatland areas, and peatlands are known to store 30% of worldwide land-based carbon, as members have also mentioned. Last year, I visited a peatland restoration project at Cursgowan within the biosphere near Wigtown with local peat restoration expert Dr Emily Taylor from the Crichton Carbon Centre in Dumfries. To see her work, Cursgowan is recorded on the World Ramsar map. Dr Taylor demonstrated how the peatland restoration worked, and when we measured the depth of the bog, it was 5 metres deep. That's a lot of carbon storage space. We spoke about how the peatlands contained in the wetland areas are protected under the EU law because of their important contribution to decarbonising our environment. Dr Taylor and colleagues from the Galloway Fisheries Trust are concerned that we may lose some of these protections after we leave the EU. I would therefore like to seek assurances from the Minister that the Scottish Government will continue to protect our wetland and peatland areas and call on the UK Government to ensure that this is a priority. Also, Presiding Officer, situated on the scenic north shore of the Solway coast, RSPB Mersehead and Calaverick National Nature Reserve are extensive wetland and salt marsh areas. Both are a haven for breeding waders, wintering waterfowl and year-round bird and wildlife watching. And the RSPB Mersehead is home to the most northerly populations of a rather special amphibian, the natterjack toad. I'm the species champion for the natterjack toad, and this wee beastie needs some support and protection. The continued survival of the wee natterjacks is determined by the protection of their dune habitats and the ability of dune systems to be able to shift with the tide and the wind. It's important because long-established ponds inhabited by natterjacks can quickly fill with predators such as fish and dragonfly larvae, which consume natterjack eggs and tadpoles, contributing to the decrease in numbers. For natterjacks, breeding in temporary ponds means breeding in an environment absent from predators. Protecting our wetlands is so important for the existence of some of our endangered species, including natterjacks, and supporting continued biodiversity. Protecting our wetland areas and natural environment is so important that, in closing, Presiding Officer, I seek assurances from the Minister that in light of Brexit and the potential loss of EU environmental protection laws, that in Scotland we will do all we can to protect our wetlands. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I now call Mary Goujon to close the government. Minister, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to close this important debate celebrating World Wetlands Day with its theme of wetlands and biodiversity. And I really want to thank John Finney for bringing this debate to the Chamber and for putting a focus on it. And as he rightly pointed out, I can't talk about any of the live applications or some of them that have been referenced in here tonight because some there have been points made which are more probably relevant for the Planning Minister who would be responsible for those. And that's why tonight I would really like to focus on why wetlands are so vital and important to us in Scotland, though I think a good job of that has been done by members across the Chamber tonight. And I think it's also particularly timely that we discuss this year, given that, again, as John Finney stated, it's Scotland's Year of Coasts and Waters, because this will promote a range of opportunities to experience and enjoy our unrivalled seas and shores, our rivers, our lochs and our wetlands. Because I think, as Finlay Carson said in his speech, there might be a lot of local people that aren't necessarily aware of what is exactly on their doorstep, which is why this themed year and this debate are so important. Because, put simply, life thrives in wetlands. And again, we've heard about that tonight. I think it was Stuart Stevenson who mentioned in his contribution that they represent, I think, 3% of our land cover, but yet are home to 10% of our biodiversity. And as Emma Harper stated, 40% of the world's plant and animal species live or breed in wetlands. Over 100,000 freshwater species have been identified in wetlands so far, and coastal wetlands especially are amongst the most biologically diverse places on the planet. And we've also heard about the wider impacts and benefits that they have. Rachel Hamilton mentioned about the effects that there are on wild salmon, for example. Now, our 51 Ramsar sites cover over 300,000 hectares, from the windswept expanses of the Caithness and Sutherland peatlands to the slightly more modest 50 hectares of Westwater Reservoir in the Pentlands. Our Ramsar sites are important, and they host a huge array of species and habitats, which are probably too numerous to list all of them here. Now, I know that Ross Greer, in his contribution, raised concern over protections for Ramsar. Now, we are currently reviewing National Planning Framework, NPF3, and Scottish Planning Policy, and we want to hear thoughts and priorities for NPF4, and the consultation is currently open on that, so I would encourage members to get involved and make their thoughts known. Now, when coming back to Ramsar and Ramsar sites in particular, I'm lucky enough, and I want to talk a bit about my own constituency here, because I have one of these truly amazing sites in my own constituency in Angus North and Mearns at Montrose Basin. Now, the basin is home to over 80,000 migratory birds, including pink-footed geese, Arctic terns, knots and sedge warblers, and is a Scottish Wildlife Trust Reserve. But to actually witness these birds at the site is something to behold, and the geese at Montrose were actually featured on BBC's Autumn Watch at the end of last year. Our wetlands range from coastal salt marshes and wet dune slacks to fens, marshes and wet woodlands and river valleys and loch edges, to the springs and flushes, wet heath and blanket bogs. But on salt marshes, and I hope you'll allow me to diverge just a little bit here again, going back to Montrose Basin, because I launched an important citizen science initiative there in December, together with Professor Bill Austin from the University of St Andrews and a class from my old school at St Margaret's Primary in Montrose, in relation to blue carbon. Because not only are our wetlands vitally important for the wide variety of species and biodiversity that exist on them, but also in relation to climate change. Now, John Finney talked about storing carbon and the capacity that they have for that, but I think I loved Stuart Stevenson's phrase as well about our wetlands being nature's shock absorbers. The project aims to encourage schools, children and students to collect soil samples from our coastal wetlands to contribute to a national carbon stock assessment, to see exactly how much carbon our wetlands store and help us assess exactly how important they are in the fight against climate change. And it's also a fantastic opportunity to get our young people actively involved in tackling climate change and really having a tangible impact. But that's where I was also interested to hear about some of the other initiatives happening elsewhere. And Finlay Carson, I think, who talked about the wetland watchers in his constituency. Now, another visit I undertook over the summer was to the Flow Country. I was impressed by the wide-ranging work being carried out to manage and promote areas of peatlands which are of national and international importance. And Claudia Beamish and others mentioned just how important these areas are for carbon storage. Now, much of the peatland restoration work in the Flow Country has been funded by the Scottish Government through Scottish Natural Heritage, which has helped to maintain this important habitat while also mitigating the effects of climate change. The Scottish Government recognises the important role peatland restoration can play in responding to the global climate emergency. And that's why this year we are funding peatland restoration to the tune of £14 million. And as I know that Emma Harper called on the Scottish Government to commit to doing what we can to protect our, well, I think woodlands and wetlands. I think we could definitely commit to protecting them both. And I think the funding that we've put in place will emphasise that work. Now, the Peatland Action Project, managed by SNH, involves public, private and third sector landowners and is restoring damaged peatlands as an important part of our climate change plan. More than 19,000 hectares of previously damaged peatland habitat have benefited directly from restoration activities since 2012, and up to 10,000 hectares is being restored this financial year. But of course, peatland restoration also has many other benefits, such as improving water quality, reducing flood risk, as well as aiding the ability to store carbon within the peat. And we're also funding several exciting wetlands projects through the Biodiversity Challenge Fund under SNH's management. And through our Agri-Environment Climate Scheme, we've committed almost £5 million for wetland management, in addition to the £31 million committed for targeted support for wading birds. But I think as important it is to talk about some of the funding and initiatives that are happening with these organisations, it's important to recognise other work that's taking place as well as other organisations. And Rachel Hamilton mentioned the work that's being done by the Tweed Forum, who indeed I visited with the presiding officer, and it is fantastic to hear about. They really are doing incredible work. However, as we've also heard tonight from Claudia Beamish and Gillian Martin in particular, the recent IPBES and State of Nature reports have thrown the condition of global and domestic biodiversity into sharp relief. The IPBES report characterised the current global response as insufficient, but concluded that it's not too late to make a difference through transformative change. The links between climate change and biodiversity loss being clearly exemplified and mirroring the findings in the Committee on Climate Change Net Zero report. Now, in response to that, the First Minister committed to considering the report's findings and ensuring that our actions produce the transformative change that's needed, analysing what we're already doing, where we need to do more, and what we need to do differently. Now, we also know that biodiversity loss and the climate emergency are interconnected, and that, as on climate change, we need to raise the bar of global leadership. The nature all around us helps regulate our climate, and the changing climate is a major factor affecting the state of nature. Nature-based solutions such as tree planting and peatland restoration mitigate climate change and flooding and improve water quality and biodiversity. The protection of our natural environment is a priority, and just as on climate change, it requires us to look freshly at how we carry out many of our activities. Now, we've already announced that we will hold a biodiversity conference in Scotland in April 2020, which will contribute to the development of the post-2020 framework. And our programme for government includes measures to continue to address the loss of biodiversity in Scotland. We announced we would increase and extend the Biodiversity Challenge Fund by a further £2 million over this financial year and next. And this is further targeted investment to help deliver the HE targets and to combat the contributors to biodiversity loss, which has been highlighted in the various reports. In conclusion, I think it's absolutely right that we celebrate and put a focus on World Wetlands Day. And it's also important to remember that this is a very big year and a vitally important year for Scotland, with a focus on our coasts and waters, on a focus on biodiversity and climate change, with us hosting COP26. I want to see us lead the world, and I believe we are in many ways already, but there's always more that can be done, and I'm absolutely committed to, and the Scottish Government is committed to driving that work forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That concludes the debate, and I close this meeting of Parliament.